The cardboard box split open like a broken promise. One moment I was climbing the narrow staircase to my third-floor apartment, arms wrapped around a delivery that had been sitting outside my door all day, and the next moment everything was cascading down the steps in a symphony of crashes and thuds, books scattered like wounded birds across the faded carpet runner. A ceramic mug, one I'd ordered to replace the one I'd broken last month in a moment of frustrated loneliness, shattered against the banister with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire building. I stood there frozen, watching my belongings tumble down toward the second-floor landing, feeling that familiar heat of embarrassment creep up my neck. This was exactly the kind of thing that happened to people like me. People who ordered books online instead of going to actual stores, people who ate dinner alone while watching Netflix, people who had lived in the same apartment building for 3 years without knowing a single neighbor's name. "Shit," I whispered, the word hanging in the stale hallway air. That's when his door opened. I had seen him before, of course. Brief glimpses in the hallway, the sound of his footsteps above me late at night, the way his mailbox read D. Morrison in neat, careful handwriting. He was older, maybe late 40s, early 50s, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of weathered handsomeness that suggested stories I would never be brave enough to ask about. We had never spoken. I wasn't sure we had even made eye contact. But now he was standing in his doorway, taking in the disaster I had created, and I wanted to disappear into the peeling wallpaper. "You okay?" His voice was deeper than I had imagined, roughened by what sounded like years of cigarettes or whiskey or both. There was something achingly gentle in the way he asked it, as if my clumsiness was worthy of genuine concern rather than polite indifference. "I'm fine," I said quickly, already moving toward the scattered books. "Sorry, I'll get this cleaned up." I know it's loud, I didn't mean to. "Hey." The single word stopped me mid-sentence. "It's okay." These things happen. He stepped into the hallway, and I caught the scent of something warm and masculine, coffee maybe, or cedar wood. He was wearing a gray sweater that had seen better days and jeans that hung just right on what I couldn't help but notice was a lean, well-maintained frame. When he bent down to pick up one of my books, I saw the way his shoulders moved beneath the wool, and something low in my stomach tightened with an awareness I wasn't prepared for. "The Remains of the Day," he said, reading the cover with what might have been approval. "Good choice." "You've read it?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, before I could remember that I was supposed to be the quiet neighbor who minded his own business. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "Years ago. Ishiguro has this way of writing about loneliness that just..." He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "Sorry. I tend to get carried away when it comes to books." "No, I know what you mean." And I did. That was exactly why I had ordered it, why my apartment was slowly filling with books about solitary people living careful, contained lives. They were mirrors I could look into without having to explain myself to anyone. He handed me the book and our fingers brushed for just a moment. His skin was warm, slightly rough, and I found myself wondering what those hands might feel like elsewhere, a thought so sudden and inappropriate that I nearly dropped the book again. "I'm David, by the way," he said. "I know we haven't officially met, but I've seen you around." "James." My name sounded strange coming out of my mouth, like I hadn't said it aloud in weeks, which, come to think of it, I probably hadn't. "James." He repeated it like he was testing the weight of it, and something about the way it sounded in his voice made my chest tighten. "How long have you lived here?" 3 years. I was gathering the rest of my belongings, trying not to notice how he lingered in the hallway, how he seemed in no hurry to retreat back to whatever solitary evening I had interrupted. "You." 5. He picked up another book, Giovanni's Room, and I felt my face burn. Of all the books that could have spilled out of that box, Why did it have to be that one? But David just smiled, a knowing expression that wasn't mocking or invasive, just understanding. Baldwin's a hell of a writer. Yeah. The word came out rougher than I intended. He is. We finished collecting my things in a silence that felt charged with something I couldn't name. Every time David handed me an item, our proximity seemed to shrink a little more. When he reached for the last book, wedged against the base of the banister, he had to lean close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the fine lines around his eyes, and the way his mouth curved slightly downward even when he wasn't frowning. There was something deeply melancholic about his face, a sadness that seemed carved into the bones themselves. It made me want to ask questions I had no right to ask, to offer comfort I had no business giving. I wondered if he ate dinner alone, too, if he fell asleep to the sound of Netflix shows he wasn't really watching, if he sometimes stood at his window looking out at the city lights and feeling like he was observing life rather than living it. There we go. He straightened up, holding a small notebook that had been hiding under the stairs. As he handed it to me, I noticed his fingers were long and elegant, the kind of hands that might play piano or write poetry. There was a thin gold band on his ring finger that looked like it hadn't been removed in years, even though something about the way he wore it suggested it no longer held the meaning it once had. "Thank you," I said, meaning it more than seemed appropriate for the situation. "Really? You didn't have to help. I wanted to." The words hung between us, heavy with implication. He cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncertain. "I was just making coffee, if you—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Sorry. You probably have things to do." The truth was, I didn't have things to do. I had a frozen dinner waiting in my freezer and a Netflix queue full of shows I watched without really seeing. I had the same evening routine I'd perfected over 3 years of living alone. Eat something forgettable, scroll through my phone until my eyes burned, fall asleep on the couch, wake up at 2 a.m. with a crick in my neck, drag myself to bed, lie awake thinking about all the ways my life had become smaller and smaller until it barely felt like living at all. But something about the way David had offered, the hope and resignation warring in his expression, made me want to be braver than I usually was. "I don't," I said quietly. "Have things to do, I mean." His face transformed. The sadness was still there, but it was joined by something that looked like relief, maybe even joy. "Good," he said, and then immediately looked embarrassed by his own enthusiasm. "I mean, if you'd like some coffee, I promise I make it better than whatever you're probably used to." I followed him into his apartment, my heart hammering with a nervousness that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. His place was a mirror image of mine in terms of layout, but that's where the similarities ended. Where my apartment was sparse and impersonal, the home of someone who had never quite figured out how to make a space feel lived in, David's was warm and cluttered in all the right ways. Books lined every available wall, stacked on tables and tucked into corners. The furniture was worn but well cared for, the kind of pieces that suggested a life fully inhabited. There were framed photographs scattered around, glimpses of what looked like travels to distant places, groups of people laughing at dinner tables, moments of connection I found myself envying immediately. "Sorry about the mess," David said, moving a stack of papers off the couch. "I don't usually have company." Something about the way he said it made me think this was a significant understatement. The apartment had the feeling of a place where one person had learned to fill all the empty spaces with solitary activities. Half-finished crossword puzzles lay scattered on the coffee table. A guitar sat in the corner, its strings looking recently tuned. The kitchen counter held evidence of someone who cooked real meals for himself, not because he had to, but because the act of caring for himself was a form of resistance against the loneliness. "It's not messy," I said, and meant it. "It's lived in. I like it." David paused in his movements toward the kitchen, turning to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Really? Really?" My place feels like a hotel room most of the time, like I'm just passing through. How long have you been just passing through? The question was asked gently, but there was something in his tone that suggested he understood the feeling intimately. 3 years, apparently. I sat down on the couch, which was soft and enveloped me in a way that made me want to stay forever. Maybe longer. I've gotten really good at living like I'm about to leave, even when I have nowhere else to go. David was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on the coffee maker. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I know that feeling. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence with a sound that was somehow both mundane and intimate. I found myself studying David as he moved around the small kitchen, noting the practiced way he reached for mugs, the careful attention he paid to the coffee's progress. There was something almost ritualistic about it, as if making coffee for another person was an act he had forgotten how to perform and was now rediscovering. How do you take it? He asked. Black is fine. He nodded approvingly. A purist. I like that. When he handed me the mug, our fingers touched again, and this time neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact lasted maybe 2 seconds longer than it should have, long enough for me to notice that his hands were slightly unsteady, long enough to wonder if he was feeling the same electric current that seemed to be running just beneath my skin. David sat down on the other end of the couch, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive that made me want to lean closer. He tucked one leg under himself in a way that was almost boyish, at odds with the weathered maturity of his face. So, he said, cradling his coffee cup between his palms. What do you do, James? Besides read books about lonely people. I felt my face heat up again. Is it that obvious? It takes one to know one. The admission was made with a self-deprecating smile that somehow made the sadness in his eyes more pronounced. I've got a whole shelf dedicated to what my ex-wife used to call books about people who never learn how to live. Ex-wife. I repeated the words carefully, not sure why the information felt significant. David's fingers found the ring on his left hand, twisting it unconsciously. 2 years ago. She said I was emotionally unavailable. Turns out she was right, just not in the way she thought. The weight of that confession hung in the air between us. I wanted to ask what he meant, but something about the careful way he had said it warned me off. Instead, I took a sip of coffee, which was, as promised, significantly better than anything I usually drank, and tried to think of something to say that wouldn't sound either intrusive or meaningless. I work in accounting, I said finally, answering his original question. Nothing exciting, lots of spreadsheets and quiet offices. What about you? I'm a translator. David's face brightened slightly, as if this was something he actually enjoyed talking about. Freelance. Mostly literary stuff, some technical documents when I need to pay the bills. What languages? French, Spanish, some Italian. I studied abroad in college and just never stopped learning them. There's something about living inside someone else's words, you know? Trying to find the exact right way to carry meaning from one language to another. It's like solving puzzles all day. I could see the passion in his face as he talked about it, the way his hands moved expressively despite the coffee cup he was holding. It was the first time since I'd met him that the sadness had completely receded, replaced by something alive and engaged. That sounds incredible, I said. I can barely communicate effectively in English, let alone other languages. I doubt that's true. David's voice had dropped to something softer, more intimate. You seem like someone who chooses his words carefully. That's its own kind of skill. The compliment hit me unexpectedly hard. When was the last time someone had said something genuinely kind about me? When was the last time someone had looked at me, really looked at me, and seen something worth commenting on? I choose them carefully because I don't have much practice using them, I admitted. I'm not exactly what you'd call social. Neither am I, anymore. David set his coffee cup down on the table and leaned back against the couch cushions. The movement brought him slightly closer to me, and I became hyper-aware of the space between our bodies, the way the soft lighting from his lamps created intimate shadows across his features. "What changed?" I asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was too personal, too probing for someone I'd known for less than an hour. But David didn't seem to mind. If anything, he looked relieved to have someone ask. "Everything," he said simply. "The divorce, obviously. But before that, I don't know. I think I spent so many years trying to be the person I thought I was supposed to be that I forgot how to just exist as myself. And once I figured out who that actually was..." He trailed off, his eyes finding mine in a look that felt loaded with meaning I wasn't sure I was ready to interpret. "It was harder to pretend?" I suggested. "It was impossible to pretend." His voice was so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him properly, and suddenly we were close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count the gray hairs at his temples. "Turns out authenticity is a lonely way to live, at least at first." My heart was doing something irregular in my chest, a rhythm that seemed to sync with the pulse I could see beating at the base of David's throat. The conversation had shifted into territory that felt dangerous and necessary at the same time, the kind of honesty that usually took months or years to build up to. "I wouldn't know," I said. "I've never been brave enough to try being authentic." "What would that look like? If you were?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I found myself studying David's face, looking for signs of judgment or mockery, but finding only genuine curiosity and something that might have been encouragement. "I think it would look like admitting that I moved to this city 3 years ago thinking I was going to reinvent myself, and instead, I just became a more isolated version of who I already was." The words spilled out before I could stop them. "It would look like acknowledging that I haven't had a real conversation with another human being in months, and that most of the time, I feel like I'm watching my life happen from the outside instead of actually living it." David was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "That doesn't sound like cowardice to me. That sounds like depression." The word hit me like a physical blow, not because it was harsh, but because it was accurate. I had spent so long thinking of my isolation as a character flaw, a personal failing, that I had never considered it might be something else entirely. "Maybe," I said quietly. "I spent 2 years in therapy after Sarah left," David continued. "Best money I ever spent, even though it felt like hell most of the time. My therapist used to say that depression is often just unexpressed authenticity. All the parts of ourselves we've been too afraid to acknowledge turned inward and poisonous." Did it help? The therapy? It helped me understand why I was so good at translating other people's words but so bad at finding my own. David's smile was rueful. It helped me figure out why I married a woman I cared about but wasn't in love with. Why I spent 20 years building a life that looked right from the outside but felt empty on the inside. The implications of what he was saying settled over me slowly, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The way he had looked at my copy of Giovanni's Room, the careful way he spoke about authenticity and pretending, the sadness that seemed to emanate from him like a physical presence. "And now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Now I live alone in an apartment full of books and try to figure out what comes after honesty." David's eyes met mine again, and this time there was no mistaking the intensity there, the question that wasn't quite being asked. "Now I translate other people's love stories and wonder if I'll ever be brave enough to live one of my own." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and terror in equal measure. I could feel something shifting between us, the careful boundaries of polite conversation giving way to something raw and real. My hands were trembling slightly around my coffee cup, and I had the wild thought that this was what it must feel like to stand at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the fall might kill you or teach you how to fly. "James." David's voice was soft, tentative. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. That book, Giovanni's Room, is that research or recognition? The question hung between us like a bridge I could either cross or burn. I knew that what I said next would determine whether this remained a pleasant conversation between lonely neighbors or became something else entirely, something that might change everything. I thought about David's weathered hands and gentle eyes, about the way he had helped me gather my scattered books without making me feel foolish or small. I thought about the warmth of his apartment and the careful way he made coffee for 2 people instead of 1. I thought about the gold ring he still wore and the ex-wife who had called him emotionally unavailable, about the years of pretending he had described with such weary familiarity. Most of all, I thought about the way he was looking at me now, not with the polite interest of someone making small talk, but with the careful hope of someone who recognized something in another person that he had been searching for without knowing it. Recognition, I whispered. The words seemed to release something in the room's atmosphere, like a held breath finally being exhaled. David's eyes closed briefly, as if he were processing the weight of what I had just told him. When he opened them again, the sadness was still there, but it was joined by something that looked like relief. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me with that. Thank you for asking." I set my coffee cup down with hands that were definitely shaking now. I don't think anyone ever has before. Really? Really. I'm very good at hiding in plain sight. David shifted on the couch, angling his body toward mine. The movement brought him closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, could see the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. "I spent 15 years hiding in plain sight," he said. "Married to a wonderful woman, living in a house with a white picket fence, going to barbecues with other couples who looked just like us. I was so good at it that I almost convinced myself it was real. What changed? I met someone." David's voice was so quiet, I had to strain to hear it. "A client, actually. A French novelist whose work I was translating. He came to New York for a book tour, and we had dinner to discuss some particularly tricky passages." He paused, his fingers finding that gold ring again. This time, he didn't just twist it. He pulled it off completely, setting it on the coffee table between us with a soft clink that sounded enormous in the quiet apartment. He was brilliant and funny and completely, unapologetically himself in a way I had never seen before. And when he looked at me, David's voice trailed off, his eyes distant with memory. It was like he could see right through all the careful lies I'd been telling myself. Not just about being attracted to men, but about what it meant to actually live as yourself instead of as some acceptable version of yourself. What happened? Nothing. Everything. David's laugh was hollow. We talked until 3 in the morning about books and art and what it meant to live authentically. He kissed me goodnight outside my hotel, just a brief thing, barely more than a brush of lips. And I went home and looked at my sleeping wife and realized I had been living someone else's life for so long that I wasn't sure I remembered what my own felt like. I could picture it so clearly. David standing in a bedroom doorway, everything he thought he knew about himself cracking open like an egg. The terrible, liberating moment when you realize that the life you've built is a beautiful prison. How long after that did you get divorced? 6 months. I tried to make it work. Tried to convince myself that what I was feeling was just a midlife crisis or some kind of temporary insanity. But Sarah knew. She could feel me pulling away, could sense that I was somewhere else, even when I was sitting right next to her. David's voice was heavy with old guilt. The worst part is that she deserved better. She deserved someone who could love her the way she needed to be loved, not someone who was just grateful for her kindness and mistaking that gratitude for romance. Did you ever see him again? The novelist? No. David's smile was sad but not bitter. I was too much of a coward then. By the time I figured out who I actually was, he had moved on with his life. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he got married last year. To a man, obviously. Someone brave enough to love him properly. The story settled over us like a blanket, heavy with shared understanding. I found myself thinking about my own years of hiding, the careful way I had constructed a life that looked normal from the outside while feeling hollow within. The difference was that David had at least tried to build something real, even if it hadn't been right. I had never even gotten that far. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "Don't be." It taught me something important about the difference between being alone and being lonely. I had been lonely for years while surrounded by people. Now I'm alone, but I'm not pretending to be someone else. There's a strange kind of peace in that. Is there? Most of the time. David's eyes found mine again, and there was something vulnerable in his expression, something that looked like a question he wasn't quite brave enough to ask. Loneliness is just the price of authenticity, at least until you find someone else who's willing to pay it. The air in the room seemed to have grown thicker, charged with the weight of everything we weren't quite saying. I could feel the conversation balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip either toward safer ground or toward something that would change everything between us. "David," I started, then stopped, not sure what I was going to say. "I know," he said quietly. "This is moving fast. Too fast, probably. You came here because I helped you pick up some books, not because you were looking for whatever this is." "What is this?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I immediately wanted to take it back. It was too direct, too honest. Too much like stepping off that cliff without knowing if there was ground beneath me. But David didn't seem alarmed by the question. If anything, he looked relieved that one of us had finally asked it. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know that I haven't felt this interested in another person in years. I know that you're the first person I've met since my divorce who makes me think that maybe loneliness isn't actually the only price of authenticity." He paused, his eyes searching my face. "I know that I invited you for coffee, but I was hoping you might stay longer than it takes to drink it." My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. Every rational part of my brain was screaming warnings. Too fast, too complicated, too many ways this could go wrong. But there was another voice underneath the panic, quieter but more insistent, saying that this was the first time in years I had felt truly awake, truly present in my own life. "I don't know how to do this," I said honestly. I've known, but I've never actually—" "Neither have I," David said softly. "Not really. Not in a way that mattered." The admission hung between us, creating a space that felt both terrifying and safe. We were both beginners here, both trying to figure out how to translate years of hidden longing into something real and present. I looked at David's face in the soft lamplight, at the way his eyes reflected a mixture of hope and fear that probably matched my own. I thought about the gold ring sitting on the coffee table between us, about the years of careful pretending we had both described, about the books scattered on my hallway floor and the way his hands had felt when they brushed against mine. "I should probably go," I said, but I made no move to leave. "You should," David agreed, but his voice was full of something that sounded like disappointment. We sat there in the heavy silence, both of us knowing that I should leave and neither of us wanting me to. The evening had already crossed so many lines, had moved from strangers helping with spilled books to something approaching confession. One more step would take us somewhere we couldn't come back from. I was still trying to find the courage to either leave or stay when David spoke again, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. "You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to." The words hung in the air between us like a bridge that neither of us had the courage to cross, but both of us desperately wanted to. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every choice that had led me to this moment, this apartment, this conversation, this man who looked at me like I was worth seeing. The evening stretched ahead of us, full of possibility and danger in equal measure, and I realized that whatever happened next would change everything, not just between us, but in the careful, contained life I had spent so long building around my loneliness. David's eyes were still on mine, patient and hopeful and terrified, waiting for an answer I wasn't sure I was brave enough to give. My lonely older neighbor changed my life forever. Gay Story. Part 2. The words hung in the air between us like morning mist, delicate and ephemeral, threatening to dissolve at the slightest movement. You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to. Marcus's voice had been barely above a whisper, but it echoed in my chest like thunder. I stood frozen in his doorway. One foot already crossed the threshold into the hallway, my body caught between staying and fleeing. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency, as if the storm itself was trying to make the decision for me. Through the glass, I could see the streetlights bleeding their amber glow into the darkness, each drop of water on the window refracting the light into tiny, scattered stars. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I was certain he could hear it. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with possibility. I turned slowly, meeting his eyes across the small space of his living room. In the lamplight, his face looked younger somehow, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. The confident, weathered man who'd shared stories of his travels and past seemed to have retreated, leaving behind someone raw and uncertain. I started, then stopped, the words catching in my throat like they were made of thorns. What was I supposed to say? That I'd been thinking about him every night since that first conversation? That the loneliness in his voice had awakened something in me I didn't even know existed? That standing here, on the precipice of something I couldn't name, terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure? The rain's pretty heavy, I finally managed, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. It was a coward's response, a way of staying without having to acknowledge what staying might mean. Marcus's mouth curved into the faintest smile, and I saw something like relief flicker across his features. It is, he agreed, stepping aside to make room for me to come back in. Sounds like it might last a while? I crossed back over the threshold, and the simple act felt monumental, like stepping across a bridge I might never be able to cross back over. The door closed behind me with a soft click that seemed to seal us into this moment, this choice, this terrifying possibility. The apartment felt different now, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Every object seemed more vivid, more present. The well-worn leather of his couch, the stack of books on the coffee table with their cracked spines and dog-eared pages, the way the lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls. I was hyper-aware of everything. The sound of our breathing, the way Marcus's sweater had pulled slightly loose at the collar, revealing a hint of collarbone, the faint scent of his cologne mixed with coffee, and something indefinably warm. Would you like something to drink? Marcus asked, his hands hovering uncertainly at his sides. I have wine or tea or... Wine sounds good, I said quickly, grateful for something to fill the silence, to give us both something to do with our hands. He nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with the storm and my racing thoughts. I found myself drawn to the window, pressing my palm against the cool glass and watching the water stream down in rivulets. The city beyond was a blur of lights and shadows, the familiar streets transformed into something mysterious and new by the rain. How had I gotten here? 3 weeks ago, Marcus had been nothing more than a polite nod in the hallway, a face I recognized but didn't know. Now, standing in his living room, agreeing to stay despite every rational voice in my head screaming warnings about complications and consequences, I felt like I was balanced on the edge of a cliff, 1 foot already in the air. Here. I turned to find Marcus holding 2 glasses of red wine, the liquid dark as blood in the low light. Our fingers brushed as he handed me mine, and the contact sent a jolt through me that was entirely disproportionate to its innocence. If he noticed my reaction, he didn't show it. But I caught the way his breath hitched slightly, the way his eyes lingered on my face for just a moment too long. "Thank you," I murmured, taking a sip. The wine was good, rich and smooth, with hints of cherry and something earthier. It warmed me from the inside out, loosening the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in my stomach. We settled on the couch, not quite side by side, but closer than mere acquaintances should sit. The space between us felt charged, like the air before lightning strikes. Marcus cradled his wine glass in both hands, staring down into the dark liquid, as if it might hold answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "I'm sorry if I made things awkward," he said finally, his voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him over the rain. "Asking you to stay, I mean, I don't get much company anymore." The admission hung between us, raw and honest in a way that made my chest ache. I thought about all the evenings I'd heard him moving around his apartment alone, the single plate I'd glimpsed in his sink, the way his eyes had lit up whenever we'd run into each other in the hallway like those brief encounters were the highlights of his day. "You didn't make anything awkward," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I wanted to stay." He looked up at me then, really looked at me, and I felt exposed under his gaze, like he could see straight through to all the uncertainty and longing I was trying so hard to hide. "Did you?" The question was loaded with more weight than 3 words should be able to carry. I took another sip of wine, buying myself time I knew wouldn't help. How could I explain that, yes, I wanted to stay, but that wanting scared me more than anything I'd ever felt? How could I tell him that I'd spent the last 3 weeks questioning everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted, about who I was? "Yes," I said finally, the word coming out barely louder than a breath. "I did." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the edges that made him look younger despite the gray threaded through his hair. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that admission settling between us like a physical thing. "I used to hate the rain," Marcus said suddenly, his gaze returning to the window. "When I was younger, I mean. It always felt like the world was crying, you know? Like even the sky was sad." He paused, taking a slow sip of his wine. "But I've grown to appreciate it. There's something honest about it. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is." I followed his gaze to the window, watching the water trace patterns down the glass. "What changed? Why do you like it now?" A ghost of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I suppose I learned that sometimes the world needs to cry. Sometimes we all do." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "There's beauty in melancholy, if you know how to look for it." His words settled into me like seeds, taking root somewhere deep in my chest. I thought about my own relationship with sadness, with loneliness, with all the complex emotions I'd spent years trying to avoid or push aside. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe there was beauty in the darker feelings, in the quiet moments between joy, in the spaces where we learn to sit with ourselves and really listen. "You sound like you've done a lot of thinking about sadness," I said, and immediately winced at how clinical it sounded. But Marcus didn't seem offended. If anything, his smile deepened. "I have," he admitted. "When you spend as much time alone as I do, you get acquainted with all sorts of feelings you might otherwise avoid." He glanced at me sideways. "What about you? Are you comfortable with being alone?" The question caught me off guard, probably because I'd never really examined it before. Was I comfortable with being alone? I'd always prided myself on my independence, on not needing anyone else to feel complete. But sitting here, in the warm glow of Marcus's lamp with rain painting patterns on the windows, I realized that maybe what I'd called independence had really been fear. Fear of depending on someone, of letting them close enough to hurt me, of discovering that I wasn't as self-sufficient as I'd always believed. I thought I was, I said slowly, the words forming as I spoke them. I've always been good at being by myself. I have my routines, my work, my books. I thought that was enough. But I met his eyes, seeing my own uncertainty reflected there. But lately, I've been wondering if being good at being alone and being happy alone are the same thing. Marcus nodded as if I'd articulated something he'd been thinking about for years. I know that feeling, he said. For a long time, I convinced myself that solitude was a choice, that I preferred it. But if I'm being honest... He paused, swirling the wine in his glass. I think I was just afraid of wanting more and not being able to have it. The admission hung in the air between us, vulnerable and brave in equal measure. I wanted to ask what he'd wanted that he couldn't have, what dreams or desires he'd pushed aside. But something about the careful way he'd phrased it told me he wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Instead, I found myself sharing something I'd never told anyone. I used to have this neighbor when I was a kid, I said, the memory surfacing unbidden. An old man named Mr. Peterson. He lived alone in the house next to ours, and my mom always told me he was antisocial, that he liked being by himself. But sometimes I'd see him standing at his kitchen window, just watching our family have dinner, and he always looked so... I searched for the right word. Hungry. Not for food, but for connection, I guess. For belonging to something. Marcus was listening intently, his dark eyes focused entirely on me. It was both unnerving and intoxicating, having someone's complete attention like that. One day, when I was maybe 12 or 13, I saw him fall in his yard, I continued. Nothing serious, he just tripped over his garden hose and went down hard. I ran over to help him up, and he was so grateful, so surprised that someone had noticed, that someone cared enough to check on him. And I realized that my mom was wrong. He wasn't antisocial. He was just lonely, and he'd gotten so used to being lonely that he'd forgotten how to ask for anything else. I took a shaky breath, surprised by how the memory still affected me. I've thought about him a lot over the years. About how easy it is to mistake solitude for contentment, to convince yourself that you don't need what everyone else seems to have. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. What happened to him? Mr. Peterson? He died about 6 months after that, I said. Heart attack. Alone in his house. It took 3 days for anyone to notice he was gone. The weight of that revelation settled between us like a stone dropped into still water. I hadn't meant to bring the mood down so dramatically, but something about Marcus's honesty had unlocked a part of me I usually kept carefully guarded. I'm sorry, I said quickly. I don't know why I told you that. It's not exactly cheerful dinner conversation. Don't apologize, Marcus said firmly. Thank you for telling me. It means something that you'd share that with me. He leaned forward slightly, setting his wine glass on the coffee table, and suddenly the space between us felt electric. I could smell his cologne more distinctly now, something warm and woody that made me want to move closer. Can I tell you something? He asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I used to think I had time, he said. Time to figure things out, time to take chances, time to stop being afraid of what other people might think or say. But watching you tonight, listening to you talk about Mr. Peterson, I realize that time isn't guaranteed. And I don't want to wake up one day and realize I spent my whole life waiting for the right moment that never came. My heart was racing so fast I felt lightheaded. What are you saying? Marcus met my eyes, and I saw something raw and vulnerable there, something that made my breath catch in my throat. I'm saying that having you here tonight talking like this, it's the most alive I've felt in years. And I know that probably sounds pathetic or desperate or It doesn't, I interrupted. my voice coming out rougher than I'd intended. It doesn't sound pathetic at all. Something shifted between us then, like a door that had been slightly ajar finally swinging open. The air in the room felt thicker, charged with possibility and want, and the terrible, beautiful vulnerability of two people standing on the edge of something that could change everything. Marcus was looking at me like he was memorizing my face, like he was trying to capture this moment before it could slip away. "I don't want to assume anything," he said carefully, "but I need you to know that this, you being here, us talking like this, it matters to me. More than it probably should." I set my wine glass down with hands that weren't quite steady, my mind racing. Every rational thought was telling me to be careful, to think about the implications, to consider what would happen tomorrow or next week or next month. But louder than all of that was the voice in my heart telling me that Marcus was right. Time wasn't guaranteed, and some moments demanded courage even when courage felt impossible. "It matters to me too," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since that first night you invited me in. I keep finding excuses to take out the trash, just hoping I might run into you in the hallway." Marcus's eyes widened slightly, and I saw hope flicker across his features like candlelight. "Really?" "Really," I confirmed, feeling lighter now that the admission was out in the open. I don't usually." I fumbled for the words, frustrated by my inability to articulate the complexity of what I was feeling. "You don't usually what?" Marcus asked gently, leaning slightly closer. "I don't usually feel like this," I said finally, "about anyone. But especially not about." I gestured vaguely between us, encompassing everything, the age difference, the gender, the complete upending of everything I'd thought I knew about myself. "About men?" Marcus supplied quietly. I nodded, grateful that he'd said it so I didn't have to. "I've never really questioned. I've always dated women. I thought I was straight. I thought I had it all figured out." I laughed, but it came out shaky. "Shows what I know." Marcus reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. When I didn't move, his fingers brushed against my hand where it rested on the couch between us. The contact was electric, sending shivers up my arm and making my breath catch. "Sexuality isn't always black and white," he said softly. "Sometimes it's just about connection. About finding someone who makes you feel seen and understood and alive." His thumb traced gently across my knuckles. "Sometimes it's about finding the person who makes you want to be brave." The gentleness in his touch, combined with the wisdom in his words, nearly undid me completely. I'd spent weeks agonizing over labels and categories, trying to fit this new feeling into a box I understood. But Marcus was offering me a different way of thinking about it, not as a fundamental change in who I was, but as an expansion, a deepening, a willingness to follow my heart even when it led me somewhere unexpected. "Is that what this is?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the rain. "You making me want to be brave?" Marcus's smile was soft and sad and beautiful all at once. "I don't know what this is," he admitted, "but I know that when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to hope for something more than just getting through another day." The honesty in his voice broke something open in my chest, flooding me with tenderness and want, and a fierce protectiveness I didn't fully understand. Without thinking, I turned my hand over so our palms could touch, threading our fingers together. His hand was warm and slightly calloused, real and solid and perfect in mine. We sat like that for a moment, hands intertwined, both of us staring down at the connection like it was something miraculous. And maybe it was. Maybe every human connection was a small miracle, two separate souls choosing to reach toward each other across the vast loneliness of existence. "I'm scared," I whispered, the admission slipping out before I could stop it. "Of what?" Marcus asked, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across my skin. of this, of what it means, of what happens tomorrow. I looked up at him, letting him see all the uncertainty and longing in my eyes, of how much I want this, even though I don't understand it. Marcus squeezed my hand gently. "Can I tell you a secret?" I nodded. "I'm scared too," he said. "I'm terrified that I'm reading this all wrong, that I'm projecting my own loneliness onto something that's just friendship. I'm scared that I'm too old for you, too set in my ways, too damaged by all the years I spent convincing myself I didn't need anyone." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "But I'm more scared of letting you walk out that door and wondering for the rest of my life what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try." His words hit me like a physical force, making my heart race and my palms sweat and my entire body ache with want. This beautiful, complicated, lonely man was offering me his heart, his vulnerability, his hope for something better than the solitude we'd both grown accustomed to. And I realized that despite all my fear, despite all the uncertainty about what this meant for my identity or my future, I wanted to say yes. I wanted to be brave enough to say yes. "Marcus," I started, then stopped, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything. We can just sit here, and you can leave when the rain stops, and we can pretend this conversation never happened if that's what you need." But that was exactly what I didn't want. I didn't want to pretend. Didn't want to go back to polite nods in the hallway and the crushing loneliness of my own apartment. I didn't want to waste whatever time we might have together by being too afraid to reach for it. Instead of speaking, I acted on pure instinct, leaning closer to him on the couch. He went very still, his eyes searching my face for any sign that I was about to pull away. When I didn't, when I continued moving closer until our knees were touching and I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, his breath hitched audibly. "Is this okay?" I whispered, my free hand coming up to rest against his chest. I could feel his heart hammering beneath my palm, nearly as fast as my own. "Yes," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "God, yes." His free hand came up to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing gently across my skin. The touch was reverent, careful, like I was something precious that might break if handled too roughly. I leaned into the contact, letting my eyes drift closed, overwhelmed by the simple pleasure of being touched with such tenderness. "You're shaking," Marcus observed softly. I opened my eyes to find him watching me with such gentle concern that it nearly broke my heart. "Are you?" He held up his free hand, and I could see the slight tremor in his fingers. "Terrified," he admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. The shared admission of our mutual fear somehow made everything easier. We were both scared, both uncertain, both stepping into uncharted territory. But we were doing it together, and that made all the difference. I leaned forward until our foreheads were almost touching, until I could feel his breath against my lips, until the space between us was measured in heartbeats rather than inches. "I want to kiss you," I whispered, the words tumbling out before I could lose my nerve. Marcus's eyes fluttered closed, and I felt rather than saw his smile. "I've been wanting to kiss you since the moment you decided to stay." "Then why haven't you?" "Because," he said, opening his eyes to look directly into mine, "I wanted to be sure it was what you wanted too. I wanted it to be your choice. The thoughtfulness of it, the respect implicit in waiting for my consent, made my chest ache with affection. This man, this beautiful, careful, lonely man, was giving me the space to want him on my own terms, in my own time. It was a gift I hadn't known I needed, and it made me want him even more. "It is what I want," I said firmly, surprised by the certainty in my own voice. "It's what I want, more than anything." Marcus's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "Then what are we waiting for?" I closed the last few inches between us, pressing my lips gently to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question more than a statement. His lips were warm and slightly chapped, and he tasted like wine and something uniquely him that I wanted to memorize. For a moment we just stayed like that, lips barely touching, breathing each other's air, both of us afraid to deepen the kiss and break whatever spell was holding us together. Then Marcus made a small sound, part sigh, part moan, and suddenly the kiss became something more urgent, more desperate. His hand tightened in my hair, and I pressed closer to him, our joined hands squeezing tight as our mouths moved together with increasing hunger. It was nothing like kissing a woman. His stubble was rough against my skin, his jaw broader, his body solid and masculine in a way that should have felt foreign but instead felt like coming home. Every nerve ending was on fire, every sense heightened to an almost painful degree. I could taste the wine on his tongue, smell his cologne mixed with something earthier and more primal, hear the small sounds of pleasure he was making against my mouth. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard, our foreheads still pressed together. My heart was racing so fast I felt dizzy, and Marcus's hand was still tangled in my hair like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. "Wow," I breathed, the word inadequate for what I was feeling, but the only thing my brain could manage. Marcus laughed, the sound shaky and breathless. "Wow, indeed." He pulled back slightly to look at me, his thumb tracing my bottom lip with reverent gentleness. "Are you okay? Was that okay?" "More than okay," I assured him, leaning into his touch. "That was..." I searched for the right word. "Perfect. That was perfect." Relief flooded his features, and he smiled that soft, vulnerable smile that made my heart skip beats. I was so afraid I was going to mess it up. It's been a long time since I've kissed anyone, and never someone who meant as much as you do. The admission made my chest tighten with emotion. "How long?" Marcus looked embarrassed. "Longer than I care to admit. Years, probably. I told you, I'm not very good at the whole connection thing." I leaned forward and kissed him again, softer this time, trying to pour all my tenderness and acceptance into the contact. When I pulled back, his eyes were wide with wonder. "You're better at it than you think," I told him. That was my first kiss with a man, and it was everything I didn't know I was looking for. Marcus's eyes searched my face like he was looking for any sign that I was just being kind. "Really?" "Really," I confirmed. I've never felt anything like that before. It was like something in me that I didn't even know was sleeping suddenly woke up. The metaphor seemed to resonate with him, because his smile deepened and he cupped my face in both hands. "I know exactly what you mean," he said. "I thought I'd forgotten how to feel this way about someone. I thought maybe I was broken, or too old, or just fundamentally unlovable. But you..." He shook his head in wonder. "You make me feel like maybe I was just waiting for the right person." The word unlovable hit me like a physical blow. How could this incredible man, this gentle soul who'd shown me such kindness and vulnerability, think of himself that way? I wanted to gather him up and protect him from every hurt that had led him to that conclusion. "You're not unlovable," I said fiercely, my hands coming up to cover his where they rested on my face. "You're not broken or too old or any of those things. You're beautiful and kind and intelligent, and anyone would be lucky to..." Marcus silenced me with another kiss, this one deeper and more desperate than the first two. I could taste the salt of tears on his lips, though whether they were his or mine I couldn't say. When we broke apart, we were both crying a little, overwhelmed by the intensity of emotion between us. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, his thumb brushing away a tear from my cheek. "I didn't mean to get so emotional. It's been so long since anyone said anything like that to me. Since anyone looked at me the way you're looking at me right now." I turned my head to press a kiss to his palm. How am I looking at you? Like I matter, he said simply. Like you see me. The simplicity of the statement broke my heart. How many people went through life feeling invisible, unimportant, forgotten? How many nights had Marcus spent alone in this apartment, convincing himself that solitude was a choice rather than an imposition? You do matter, I said, meaning every word, and I do see you. I see how gentle you are with that stray cat that hangs around the building. I see how you hold doors for elderly neighbors even when they don't notice. I see how you light up when you talk about places you've traveled, and how you get that little crease between your eyebrows when you're thinking hard about something. I see how lonely you are, but also how much love you have to give if someone would just let you. Marcus closed his eyes, a fresh wave of tears spilling over. Stop, he whispered. You're going to make me fall in love with you. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and terror in equal measure. I felt my own breath catch, realizing that maybe it was too late for warnings, maybe we were already falling, whether we acknowledged it or not. Would that be such a terrible thing? I asked softly. Marcus opened his eyes, and I saw my own feelings reflected there. The fear, yes, but also the hope, the desperate want, the sense that this moment was precious and fragile and worth protecting at all costs. No, he said finally. I don't think it would be terrible at all. The storm outside seemed to have intensified while we'd been lost in each other. The rain now coming down in sheets that blurred the windows and made the world beyond feel very far away. We were cocooned here together, sheltered from everything but each other, and I realized I never wanted to leave this moment, this feeling, this perfect bubble of connection we'd created. Come here, Marcus murmured, shifting on the couch to make more room and opening his arms to me. I didn't hesitate, settling against his side with my head on his shoulder and my hand splayed across his chest. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me close, and I felt something in my chest unclench that I hadn't even realized was tight. This was what I'd been missing all these years. Not just physical closeness, but emotional intimacy, the feeling of being held not just with arms but with care, with attention, with the kind of tenderness that made you feel precious. Is this okay? Marcus asked, his cheek resting against the top of my head. This is perfect, I murmured, breathing in his scent and letting myself melt into his warmth. I could stay like this forever. His arms tightened around me. I wish you could. We lay like that for a long time, listening to the rain and to each other's breathing. Marcus's hand traced lazy patterns on my back, and I found myself growing drowsy despite the emotional intensity of the evening. There was something deeply soothing about being held like this, about the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my ear, about the way he pressed occasional kisses to the top of my head like he couldn't quite help himself. Tell me something, I said drowsily. Something I don't know about you. Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking. I used to paint, he said finally. Watercolors mostly. Landscapes and cityscapes, nothing very good, but it made me happy. I haven't picked up a brush in probably 15 years. Why did you stop? Another pause. Life, I guess. Work got busy, I convinced myself I didn't have time for hobbies. And then after a while it just felt silly. A man my age playing with paints like a child. I lifted my head to look at him, seeing the wistfulness in his expression. That's not silly at all. Creating something beautiful is never silly, regardless of age. Marcus met my eyes, and I saw hope flicker there. Maybe I should try again sometime. I'd love to see your paintings, I said. Do you still have any? A few, packed away in the closet. He smiled self-consciously. They're really not very good. I doubt that, I said firmly. But even if they weren't technically perfect, I bet they're full of feeling. That's what matters. Marcus's hand came up to cup my cheek again, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on my skin. How do you do that? Do what? Make me feel like maybe I'm not as broken as I thought. The question made my heart ache. You're not broken, I said, leaning into his touch. You're just unused, like a beautiful instrument that's been sitting in a case for too long. It might need tuning, but the music is still there. Marcus's smile was radiant. I like that metaphor. Good, because I have more where that came from, I said, settling back against his chest. Now tell me something else. Something happy this time. Something happy, he mused, his fingers resuming their gentle patterns on my back. When I was 12, my family took a trip to the coast. We stayed in this little cottage right on the beach, and every morning I'd get up before dawn to watch the sunrise over the ocean. I'd never seen anything so beautiful, all those colors painting the sky, the waves rolling in like they'd been doing it since the beginning of time. I felt so small, but also so connected to everything, like I was part of something infinite and meaningful. His voice had taken on a dreamy quality, and I could picture him as a young boy, standing alone on a beach, watching the world wake up around him. Do you still like sunrises? I asked. I do, though I don't often make the effort to see them anymore. He paused. Maybe we could watch one together sometime. The casual suggestion made my heart skip a beat. It implied a future, plans beyond tonight, the possibility of more moments like this. I'd like that, I said, meaning it completely. Yeah? Yeah. I've never been much of a morning person, but for you, I'd make an exception. Marcus's laugh rumbled through his chest, and I felt it as much as heard it. Careful, or you'll make me think you might actually want to spend more time with me after tonight. I lifted my head again to meet his eyes, wanting him to see the sincerity in my expression. I do want that. I want to spend as much time with you as you'll let me. Something shifted in Marcus's face, surprise giving way to wonder, giving way to a joy so pure it took my breath away. Really? Really, I confirmed. Marcus, tonight has been... It's changed something in me. Something fundamental. I don't want to go back to the way things were before, to being strangers who nod politely in the hallway. I want to know you, all of you. I want to hear more stories about your travels and see your paintings and learn what makes you laugh. I want... Marcus silenced me with a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of gratitude. When we broke apart, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I want all of that too, he whispered. More than I've ever wanted anything. The storm outside seemed to be finally beginning to ease, the drumming on the windows growing softer, more sporadic. Part of me was relieved. The intensity of the evening had been almost overwhelming at times. But another part of me was sad to see it end, knowing that when the rain stopped completely, this magical bubble we'd created would have to pop, and we'd have to face the reality of what we'd started. As if reading my thoughts, Marcus tightened his arms around me. You know you don't have to leave when the rain stops, he said quietly. You could stay. If you want to. The offer hung in the air between us, loaded with implication. I knew what he was suggesting, and I knew what my answer was before I'd even fully processed the question. I want to, I said simply. More than anything. Marcus's smile could have powered the entire building. Are you sure? I don't want you to feel pressured, or like you have to. I stopped him with a finger pressed gently to his lips. I'm sure, I said. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The truth of it surprised me. Despite all the uncertainty about what this meant for my identity, despite the fear about what would happen tomorrow or next week, I was absolutely certain that I wanted to stay here with Marcus, to continue exploring this connection we'd discovered, to see where this beautiful, terrifying thing between us might lead. Marcus caught my finger in his hand, pressing a soft kiss to the tip before intertwining our fingers again. Then stay, he said simply. Stay as long as you want. Outside, the rain